hocalarım, değerli meslektaşlarım, oturumu biraz geç başlatmamızı istediler. Üçüncü oturumumuzun ilk konuşmacısı Arienne Dwyer Hanım. Konuşmasının başlığı Close Chaining in Salon.
Thank you. So I'm going to speak in English, and I'm also going to race through a lot of slides because 15 minutes is not a lot of time. So I'm mostly going to talk about clauses, but at the beginning of this talk, since this is about endangered Turkic languages, I think it's important to have a macro perspective on how we assess language endangerment, so I threw in a few slides about how to do that, and then I will zoom into a micro perspective and talk about two things: clause chains and co-verbal constructions, and these are of course related, and I will pose the question if this complicated situation is due to language contact and thus endangerment or some other reason. And unsatisfyingly, I will not really answer this question. Okay, so first off, to assess endangered languages, I would, and many people here are in the business of claiming that Turkic languages are endangered or are threatened, then there are a couple handy tools to use. I'm not going to talk about this at length, but some of us got together at UNESCO 9 years ago and put together a document which you can find online called Language Vitality and Endangerment. And there are 9 factors by which you can measure whether or not a language is endangered. And I'm not going to talk about all these, but you can see. If you're interested, come see me or look online for it. Okay, so I'm talking about Salar, which is found in North or Amdo, Tibet. And this is a situation where there are not just Salars, but Tibetanized Mongols, Tibetanized Turks, and Chinese in this area. All of these people, and of course it's not just linguistic Tibeticization and Sinicization, but also cultural. So all of these blobs represent some of the groups that we're talking about. Good Salar Muslim green, Buddhist yellow, and Mongol blue here. So to my main topic, that is clause chains. I'm talking about 2 or more dependent clauses that bear a particular morphology, one clause being finite with some sort of special morphology that's different from a dependent clause. And as we all know, the independent finite clause has full verb morphology, whereas the dependent chain clauses have reduced morphology. The dependent clauses are syntactically subordinate, but semantically they often expressed a coordinating sense, and from the point of view of event structure can be seen as a single chain of a macro event. In Turkic, we know that that finite clause comes at the end, and there's one or more non-finite clauses conjoined with a, or ip. In Salar, we find the a, but no ip. So a is only used as a durative iterative marker, and it's only with a reduplicated single verb like otra, padun kishur çıkmış. So after a long while, durative, a woman appeared. So Salar, however, has not been suffering, and nor has it been standing still. Instead of yip, we have a number of quasi-converbials, one that may not be instantly recognizable, but is the very highest frequency in my corpus, which was searched for this paper, is a suffix that is variously chana, chanen, jinen, and so on. You can see examples here. İcasındaki oyuna yetçenen işagan, so after he arrived at his mother's house, or takkabarmış, bacine beşlik olmuş. So going there, it became evening. So these both have a pretty strong sequential sense, but not always, particularly when you have a few other morphological markers. So the third example is more coordinative. So you have a ana geljinen shi inji bu ilu shi afdoerige. So here geljinen is followed by a particle that is a topic marker. It actually comes from the Chinese copula shi, and then it has a coordinating sense here. And as far as I can tell, this very frequent suffix comes from a Mongolian imperfective converb. And I should note that many of these are followed by a pause, which I mark here with a comma. So 167 out of 193 identified samples here. We also have a couple of other suffixes. I'm just giving 2 out of many, many examples. The two most common ones. So we have an instative, sometimes just sequential, gana. So as in ana bir gana valamış. So as the girl entered the grave, they dug it. There's a lot of kind of depressing stories. This corpus. Or uulci yaşırmış, yasırgani, ecasi avasını yaşamış eda, and so on. So as soon as she lied, the mother said to her son, so and so. So we see a slight difference in semantics here. These are also not as frequent, by about 4 times less frequent than Baichana. And we have many, many others. Here's a few more examples that are connectives and are not converbs. So we have things like gu and ana and limitative gun. So we have something like inji dichen yurgu etolaji yurgu belechenen inji, etc. So this is really and then. Now this is based on spoken discourse, so it has all the repair and all the features of spoken language. I have not cleaned this up at all except for the spelling. And here you can see an example of the na-na and the wunchuk here, for what it's worth. Okay, gotta rush on here. You might ask, well, okay, have you picked these examples out, cherry-picked these examples, as it were? Let's see what Salar does in a continued naturalistic discourse. And you can see that there's a number of different subordinate clause linkers, and I have underlined many of these that I've talked about and made in red the adverbs, which will feature later in this talk. Of course, there's not much later to be had. If we pull this discourse stretch apart, we can find sequential coordinative type linkers like this chalan, temporal clauses, which I'm really not discussing here, randa, and so on. Adverbs are very frequent, headless relatives, which I'm not going to discuss here, but notably no coverbs, so no auxiliaries, nothing, ip, anything, and not even juxtaposed. So these are, not only does the ip suffix itself not exist, but these constructions that are actional and aspectual are rather rare in the language. However, they exist and everybody's curious about them, so that's my second topic. It's a structure like this with 2 semantic heads and 1 or 2 predicates. So if it's 1 predicate, I'm comfortable calling the second verb a light verb. If it's actually 2 predicates, then it's, I think, better to call these, to call the second verb a coverb, and that's why I'm calling this such. I should say first that I had expected when I searched the corpus this time to find what I'm showing you now, which is that Eastern Salar, the focus of this talk, would have no juxtaposed verbs at all. It would just have adverbs. Because when I compared Western Salar spoken in Xinjiang with Eastern Salar spoken in Indo-Tibet, you find juxtaposed verbs with a light verb or auxiliary verb, whatever you want to call it, serving as an actional or a spectual marker, and a parallel sentence in the Eastern Salar is marked with a borrowed Tibetan adverb, suddenly, okay, but the suddenly here is expressed with the verb yur, which has been, of course, grammaticalized. But actually, in searching the corpus, I did find some coverbs. I expected to find directionals, and of course these are the most common. So directionals are like dashina çıkbarsa, so çıkbar to go out, çıkgel to come in. These are kind of boring, but nonetheless interesting to see that the bare verbs are juxtaposed. The only aspectual actional verbs that occur are vol and otur, and the other ones that you might expect to occur, especially because you can see them on steroids in Uyghur, do not. Don't have time to show you most of them, but one thing I wanted to point out is that the directionals, at least, allow more intervening material than many other Turkic languages. I'm thinking right now of Uyghur, but I can think of some others as well. So the directionals will allow the conjunctor da. So in like dashina çıkgel is okay, but it's also possible to say dashina çıkgel, come outside. Another intervening piece of material that really surprised me was the imperfective participle ar, which is normally in Salar, like in Old Turkic, a finite predicate. Okay, it doesn't normally come in this position, but it does show up a few times in the corpus. So you have çıkar gelmiş. And I would note that in the most neighboring Turkic language, Sarıyuhur, it also allows intervening material between the two verbs conjoined with ip, and allows a ma, but in at least the sample that I have, it reads like translatees from Chinese. So if you read this in Chinese, this has exactly the same syntax, and whereas the Salar Dada pattern's pretty much like Turkish, including it will conjoin two finite verb clauses. So that's something interesting. There are many, many more. This is a non-exhaustive sample of the kinds of coordinative sequential clause chaining opportunities that one has in Salar. And I'm ignoring all of the things like relative clauses, temporal and conditional clauses, and so on. So what we see, I hope I'm doing okay for time here, is that for the coverbs, that directionals are the most frequent, and these are almost certainly due to contact with Northwest Chinese, which, with just like the examples I showed you, juxtaposes two bare verbs, and Northwest Chinese has directional complements and it has resultative complements, and it never, ever, ever has actional or aspectual complements. Salar does have at least vol, yur, otur, and ber, like the benefactive ber, and one very dubious example of koi that I'm not willing to bet on, but it does not have these other possibly expected or available verbs in an aspectual or actional usage. And we note that Salar allows more intervening material than many other Turkic languages. I'm wondering, yeah, okay. So it's often stated about endangered languages and languages that have become creolized, which one can argue that Salar is with Tibetan and Mandarin, that grammars become simplified under a heavy contact situation. And you can see from this long list of, and this is not at all exhaustive, of clause linking possibilities, that the grammar is not at all simplified. We do see some contact effects with Mandarin, none that I can find, at least in the clause linking syntax from Tibetan, but most of the morphology and syntax remains Turkic, but it is not very prototypically Turkic, so it seems to be following many paths here to get to this combination of usages. And I think the unsatisfying conclusion that I'm going to leave you with is that I'll have to do more research on the discourse function of these various clause linking strategies, which will no doubt explain more about their uses. So thank you very much. Also to the Salars of Qinghai and Xinjiang.
It's you too. You have used your time. You have more 30 seconds.
30 seconds? I'll take a question then.
Questions is later. Take
Okay.
notes. Thanks.
Thank you.
İkinci konuşmacımız Nugteren. Konuşmasının başlığı Salarca ve Sarıgülüca'da arkaizm ve yenileşmeler. Buyurun.
Going to hand it, but it's not the text I'm going to read completely because it would take too long. So my subject touches upon a couple of things that Arienne just mentioned. And interestingly, I have some different opinions because I didn't know hers yet. But spot the difference, I would say. So originally I was going to speak about innovations and archaisms in Salar and Western Uyghur, because they are isolated from their direct relatives in the Turk family. They have this peculiar combination of very old features and very new features. That was what I was originally going to talk about, but now when I was working on it, I discovered that it's the intermediate layer between the very new features and the very old features, which is very interesting, and that's usually the most characterizing features of the language. It means that makes the languages special, and that is also one of the main reasons why it would be a pity if these languages wouldn't be spoken anymore. Because if we lost the archaic Oghuz features of Salar, then we would still have other archaic Oghuz features elsewhere. And if we would lose the Spraakbund features, then we would still have the Spraakbund features in other members of the Spraakbund. So I think the intermediate material is very interesting. So, and with intermediate, I don't mean that we can actually put a date on it, but it means that after they split off from their relatives and long after Old Turkic, they developed all kinds of things because of their own productivity and not necessarily under the influence of neighbors. One thing that is very clear in Salar and Western Uyghur is that although they have similar influences now, actually they have similar problems, but they don't always choose the same solution to solve it. For instance, there's a lot of morphology which is under pressure or is being abolished, like the verb endings, the personal ending to the verb, and some of the other complexities are getting lost. But the process of loss is not the same in both of them. As an example, I could give the thing that's on the handout on under 1, and that's the simplification of the possessive suffixes. And in Salar you can see that the simplification is that they abolish more or less the distinction in number. That means that the oyim can also be used for our house. And in Western Uyghur, this is not the way they do it. They abolish almost all the possessives in all cases, except when you are talking directly to a person, and then you would say anan to my mother, like the French do, ma mère. But it would also be the word for your mother. So the distinction between the first and second persons is abolished. So it's they have a similar pressure apparently to reduce the system, but they reduce it in a different way. And of course, the end result may be that they abolish the suffixes altogether and just use the genitive meaning or meaning you. Okay, I will skip that. So under the numerals, is this visible as well? Yeah. So in the numeral system, there's an interesting mixture of old and new stuff as well. But I think probably the most famous thing about Western Europe is that they preserve the whole Turkic anticipating counting system. But actually they don't preserve all that much of it. They preserve it up to 30 at most among all people. But it's still there, so you can see it. And at the same time they have this innovation replacing the tense system by new analytical forms. Which is also found in South Siberia, so you just get 2 tens, 3 tens, 4 tens, etc. And then it's also typical that there are some innovations which we can't explain, like the Eli on as an alternative to Mush. I don't know why it is, maybe Arienne knows. I haven't seen any good reason to start at that moment and make new numerals. And there's and there's another thing which can't be explained internally, but may have to do with the desire to have a kind of secret language when Chinese people are around. And that's the word ayak, which is a bowl to eat from, and it now also means 10,000 in Western Europe. And similarly in Salar, the word for bowl, zamze, now also means 10,000. And I don't know exactly the tones in the dialects of the region, although they're not the same as the standard ones. But it could be there, those words, the word one and one with different tones, mean a bowl and 10,000 in Chinese. And it might have been similar enough to create a secret word for 10,000, for instance, if you're on the market and you want to negotiate over the heads of Chinese buyers. So we see here old things, new things, and some things we don't understand how they came about. And then another interesting thing which has happened is that lots of new words were formed with normal Turkic suffixes from normal Turkic stems. And the only thing that's surprising about it is that today the word formation suffixes, the choice of word formation suffixes is extremely small in these languages. So in Old Turkic you had maybe 10 or 20 suffixes to make a verb out of a noun. And in modern Uyghur, for instance, you have 1 or 2 which are allowed. So if, for instance, if you want to make a verb out of a Chinese word, actually you only have la as a viable choice. But in the pre-modern period, there's lots of old new verbs formed, like the ones here. So for instance, as to azar, to become, few. And this is interesting because Old Turkic and other Turkic languages have other forms with other suffixes which were already well established, but they abolished those and instead used these. So this applies to the verbalizer a and the verbalizer u as well. So the second set here, like koyl, thick. They made a new verb out of it, koyze, to become thick. And there's a couple of others here. And the third example of a suffix that used to be very fruitful and isn't now is the verbalizer in ar. It's also made several forms. But in Uyghur, mostly the base verb doesn't exist anymore. So yukar doesn't exist. They only have yukar l for the intransitive and yukat for the transitive. But because we don't have old Western Uyghur, we can't really tell if this yukar as a base was used at all. Yeah, and another interesting thing is the formation of new finite verb forms. So Old Turkic had lots of finite verb forms, so there wasn't a shortage of them, but both in Salar and in Uyghur you can see several new tense aspect forms which are made out of existing suffixes. And I want to give two examples from Western Uyghur here. So there are two normal deverbal noun suffixes which became participles and then became finite tenses, probably in that order because we weren't there when it happened. So an example is gak. That's a very normal Turkish suffix which indicates the inclination or the aptitude to do a certain activity, which is already well attested in Old Turkic. And in Uyghur this became a participle and a finite tense. So this example is an example for a participle as a complement of a sentence. And this is a thing that the aorist suffix could have done as well, but they use it here with ak. And then you get it as a finite form like here. I often go to Haji. And this is not very shocking in the sense that the semantics of the verbal form are still very close to the noun form, but it's still not something that has happened in lots of Turkic languages. And one reason could be outside of Western Uyghur. It could be that the fact that Mongolic languages have a special habitual form could have contributed to the fact that they wanted a form like that as well in their system. Because there's of course lots of bilingual people who like to have one-on-one correspondences. And the second one is guch. It's also a very normal Turkish suffix, and this has become a present future tense. And it may owe this change to the fact that gu is already known as a future form, but still it's kind of peculiar. I don't know if this happened anywhere else in the Turkic languages. So it's also used to make objects like yish, food from ye plus this suffix. And then it's used as a verbal noun which can take case suffixes. And eventually it's also become a finite tense form. So in the second sentence here you can see English, which also is the word for a towel, a cleaning cloth. You can also use it in a finite verb. Then there's another thing that I just saw in Arienne's materials as well. There's imperative, local. And the opinions I've seen in publications are that it's either a particle which happens to be restricted to the imperative, or it might be a suffix. But in both cases, I haven't seen an explanation what the etymology is. I think it might involve the verb tur, perhaps with a future suffix. For me it's very hard to decide if it's a suffix or a particle, but if it's a particle, it's a very specialized one. And then I come to the negative imperative. So this is not the normal imperative because you can just use the normal stem as an imperative form. And also the normally negated stem as a negative imperative, the prohibitive form. So in this case, dingma would be possible as well. I'm not aware of a very clear semantic distinction. Tanisha thinks it's from ding koima, so the verb koi is in, according to him, and the recent publication by Abibullah follows this. But I think it could also be kul, to do, although it's not a very frequent verb at the moment. And I mainly think this because of the first person imperative, which has the ending ulali as one of the possible endings. And there the first L couldn't be explained by the verb koi that would be in there. This one. And then there's this thing, compound participles. Up to a point, this is also seen in other Turkic languages, but in both in Uyghur and in Salar, this is specifically used to make a participle out of verb forms which don't have an ancient participle associated with it. So because of the new tense forms, there is a kind of desire to have some additional participles. So they made kind of compound participles. So the combination, like in the first sentence, pargati means to say I'm going. So it means I want to go. And you can put that in the participle form in this way. And also in the Salar sentence, et kor again. So that's literally the thing of which I said I will do it. But it just means the thing I want to do. It could be, it's a future participle but compound. And then another Salar novelty. And that's interesting again. Western Yugur is very peculiar in some aspects, but for instance, the converbs of Yugur are quite normal if you compare lots of Turkic languages. They are not that shocking. But in Salar there are several which are a bit peculiar. But Arienne just offered a couple of etymologies where I was still struggling. So it's nice to compare notes. So I'll just go quickly through a couple of them. So this Gashli is something that I don't know of any other Turkic language, but I suppose it could be the Gach converb, which is normal elsewhere, combined with Layu, the comparative case suffix. But I can't prove it because leap is normally also the reflex of look. But it would make some semantic sense. And then the Bunchuk, we've seen before, I was struggling with that one. Well, you can compare notes, and I will certainly have a talk with Arienne about this one. But it's at least the interesting thing for me to collect it here was that I don't know it from elsewhere in this shape, and I didn't know the explanation. But it's a specific Salar thing. And then I have this Chan, and Arienne had an explanation from Mongolic. And that would be an alternative to what I say here. But yeah, I'm not sure if we can quickly prove it without having all Salar materials. But again, it's something that, for instance, if you look in Turkmen, you won't find it. And this one, yes. Also, this is very transparent. You would say it looks like the participle with the genitive case, and it probably is, but it has a different meaning. It has a causal, it indicates a causal relationship. So, because she was sick. To the Salar verb yoch with a question mark, and the question mark is because it's not entirely sure if it's considered to be a verb by the speakers. But yoch is a very normal word, as you all know, and it has some normal functions we can see in all Turkic languages. So it indicates.
For 1 minute. Just for 1 minute.
1 minute, okay, I can do that.
Already past 3 minutes.
Already. Good. Number 8, my last point. Okay, yoch is very normal, but I want to show you the abnormal bit before I step off the. Okay. So, and there's this. Yoch can take suffixes that yoch normally can't. So it takes participle and converb suffixes. And the real reason why this happens is because there's a verb bol, the auxiliary verb to be, is reduced into nothingness there, and in some texts we can see that it's yoch bol gan, or something like that. But now on the surface, it looks like yoch is partly a verb, and especially in this manga ish yoch masab, there you can see that yoch already is negative, but ma, the negation is put there again. So it should be if I don't have no work. It doesn't work in English either, but it's kind of peculiar. It looks like a verb. Okay, that was my last point, I think. Let's stop here. Thank you.
Üçüncü konuşmacımız Pekin Merkezi Milletler Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Doktor Zhong. Buyurun. Bildiri başlığı yok olma tehlikesinde olan Sarı Uygur'da son zamanlarda yapılan birkaç kalıtım faaliyet raporu.
Sayın benim kurum Sarı Uygurca üzerinde son zamanlarda yapılan birkaç kalıtım faaliyeti raporu. Onun önce Türkiye'de Türkçe öğrenir. Şimdi fazla kurum katı. Yavaş yavaş biraz sevdim. Onun için bir nüfusu sahip olan Sarı Uygurlar, Çin'in nüfusu az olan azınlıklardandır. Sarı Uygurları iki dil kullanılmaktadır. Biri Altay dil ailesinin Türkçe grubunda biri Batı Sarı Uygurca. Diğeri de Altay'ın dil Alsı'nın Moğolca grubunda biri Doğu Sarı Uygurca'dır. Günümüzdeki Sarı Uygurca'nın kullanılanları azalmaktadır. Sarı Uygurca tehlikeli olan dillerden biri durumunda gelmiştir. Sarı Uygurca'yı korumak ve kurtarmak amaca ile Sarı Uygur bölgesinde asarda birlikteki gibi çeşitli kadın faaliyetle düzenlemektedir. Birinci, okul ve ana okulunda Sarı Uygurca eğitim ve öğretim faaliyet. Yakın yıllarda sunan Sarı Uygur üzeri ilçe merkezinde Sarı Uygurca eğitim program düzenlenmiştir. İkinci, Sarı Uygurların yoğun yaşadığı köylerde Sarı Uygurca kurslar düzenlenmiştir. Sunan Sarı Uygur Kültür Virüsü Temmuz 2010 Tahı Köyün Şirin Mahallesi'nde Sarı Uygurca kurslar düzenlenmiştir. Üçüncü, Orta Lise Birleşik Okulu'nda Sarı Uygurca konuşma yarışmasının yapılması. Dördüncü, orijinal Sarı Uygur konserinin yapılaması, konserde Sarı Uygurca ile sunum yapılmaz. Ocak 2012 tarihinde sunan Sarı Uygur Araştırma Virüsü ve sunan Meslek Eğitim Okulu ortak olarak Yayla Bahar Gildi başlıklı orijinal Sarı Uygur konseri yaptılar. Konserde genel olarak Sarı Uygurların eski türkü ve sarı kelleri ile geleneksel yaşamanın yayınsından okullar sahnelenmiştir. Konserde sunucunun Çince, Batı Sarı Uygurca ve Doğu Sarı Uygurca sunuculuk yapılması özellikle dikkate çıkmıştır. Burada biraz isterim. Beşinci sona ilişkisinde radyo istasyonunda Sarı Uygurca masalar ve türkü söyleme program yapılmaz. Altıncı ilişki merkezinde televizyon kanalında benimle bir örgün program yapılamaz.
Bugün men sot işçilerinin atlarım burlar edim. Qaydasında laretken emes bolsa, qarqısı, bezik kısleri bana bir dur. Nayzi? Sut, sut, sut, sut. Nay kopa, qırıp, kırık, kırık, kırık. Nai jiao mu, kunerge, kunerge, kunerge, kunerge. Chou nai zi, yogurt, yogurt, yogurt, yogurt. Nai qi, kayak, kayak, kayak, kayak. Xuan nai, sumak, sumak, sumak, sumak. Su yu, yang, yang, yang, yang. Şila, çörme, çörme, çörme, çörme. Nai lao, evdek çörme, evdek çörme, evdek çörme, evdek çörme. Sen şila, şarılmak çörme, şarılmak çörme. şarılmak çörme, şarılmak çörme. 黄水也就是熬取拉剩的水。过，过，过，过。원래 요거는 벌써 특이한 앞대로 시대 같아서 안 가더니 그런 시대 비긴 İngiliz sözde işte yogurt denilen üstünde yogurt sözde yogurt denilen. Ya bundan söyleyene dinahtin. Kaçaran anlayan kişilerine cevapte mesele mi tahta bilsin?
İkincisi Uygur Kültür Araştırmaları Derneği kurulması planlanmaktadır. Teşekkür ederim.
Sayın Zhong Jinwen'e çok teşekkür ederiz. Bunlar çok yeni. Son 2 yılda olan şeyler. Ben 2009'da gitmiştim, bilmiyorum. Çok yeni. Olumlu gelişmeler. Çok teşekkür ederim. Son konuşmacımız bu oturumda Janlar Yuşa olacaktı ama gelemedi. Yarın gelecek. Bilgisini galiba yarın veya Cuma günü okuyacak. Cuma sabah, evet. Janlar'ın bilgisi Cuma sabahıymış. Onun yerine Azerbaycan'dan, Nahçıvan'dan Galibe Hacıyeva hanım çıkacak. Doçent Doktor Galibe Hacıyeva. İdris'in başlığı Türk tarihi diyalojisinin öğrenilmesinde Manuşa şivesinin ağzının rolü. Buyurun.
Önce üç tarafı dağlar, yağlar, bir tarafı bağlanmış, kardeş kapılı eski Oğuz Türk yurdu Nahçıvan'da tüm Türk dünyasına kucak dolu sevgi ve saygılarımı çaktırmakla bildirimi sunmak istiyorum. Aslında Mamuş ağzı üzerine bizim değerli hocalarımız Ürfan Marina, Mehmet Uzak Hafiz, Hacıda ve Cemalettin Tunağlıgil'in araştırmaları var. Ben bu araştırmaları genel kaynak olarak ele alarak Mamuşa ağzını Ümum-Türk lehçeleri, yani resmi devlet dili olan ve aynı zamanda resmi devlet dili olmayan Türk topluluklarının diliyle karşılaştırmaya çalıştım. Bu çalışmada benim amacım Mamuşa ağzı ile diğer Türk ağızlarında, lehçelerinde ve resmi devlet dili olan Türkçelerimizde ortak ve farklı özellikleri ortaya çıkarmak istedim. Aslında konuyla ilgili ben özür dilerim. Bilgisayar yani ben unuttum odamda, almadığım için böyle bazı konuları sunacağım. Son konuşmacı olarak da çalışacağım, zamanınızı çok almayın. Bazı yani önemli konular üzerine dayanın. Ümum-Türk dil tarihinin öğrenilmesinde çeşitli alanlarda mevcut Türk halklarının diyalekt ve şivelerinin araştırılması çok büyük önem taşımaktadır. Edebi dilin tekmilleşmesinde ve günümüze kadar geçtiği tarihi merhalede diyalekt ve şivelerin rolü inkar edilemez. Bunun için ilk önce resmi devlet dili olmayan Türk topluluklarının mevcut olduğu bölgeler üzere ağız araştırmalarının yapılması çok önemlidir. Türk halklarının yaşadığı ayrı ayrı bölgeler üzere ağız araştırmalarının yapılması ve karşılaştırılması, çeşitli alanlardaki Türk halklarının ağızlarındaki mevcut ortak dil unsurlarını ortaya çıkarmakla beraber aynı zamanda birçok tarihi diyalektoloji faktörlerin öğrenilmesi için de büyük imkan yaratıyor. Bu faktör, çağdaş Türk dillerinin hem ortak hem de farklı özelliklerinin tarihi bakımdan çok ciddi araştırma konusu olduğunu kanıtlıyor. Bu bakımdan Kosova'nın Mamuşa yöresi ağzı, çağdaş Türk dillerinin tarihi bakımdan araştırılıp öğrenilmesinde en zengin kaynaktır. Çağdaş Türk lehçelerinin birçoğunda mevcut ortak dil örneklerinin Mamuşa ağzı esasında fonu varyantlarının araştırılması, Türk edebi dil ve diyalektolojisinin hala yüze çıkarılmamış leksik, semantik ve gramer özelliklerinin daha eski katmanlarının açılmasına imkan yaratıyor. Mamuş ağızlarında rastladığımız birçok leksemlerin fonetik yapısının ve semantik anlamının çağdaş Türk dillerinin birçoğunda, özellikle Oğuz grubu Türk dillerinde, Kuzey ve Güney Azerbaycan, Anadolu yörelerinde diyalektal seviyede olduğu şekilde korunması ilginç bir konu gibi